Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. The crime scene didn't start with a body. It started with a silence. On the night of June 12th, 1994, Brentwood, a quiet, upper-class enclave in Los Angeles, came to a hard stop. No sirens yet, no headlines, just two lifeless figures at the foot of a modest condominium's front steps, blood pooling beneath them in a pattern too controlled for accident, too brutal for coincidence. One of them was Nicole Brown Simpson, 35. The other, Ronald Goldman, 25. Both were declared dead at the scene. The home they were found in front of, 875 South Bundy Drive, didn't appear ransacked. The front gate showed no signs of forced entry. Nicole's vehicle was still in the driveway. Her children were asleep upstairs untouched. And yet, in the small courtyard below the stairs, a former wife and a young restaurant employee were brutally murdered. The woman's throat had been slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. The man's wounds were scattered across his arms, torso, and neck, indicative of a defensive struggle. This wasn't a robbery. There was no sexual assault. There was no clear escape route, no eyewitnesses. The scene was deliberate and the act overkill, which for seasoned LAPD investigators often signals one thing: a personal connection between the perpetrator and the victims. And there was one name no one could avoid: O.J. Simpson. He wasn't just Nicole's ex-husband. He was a household name. Former NFL running back, Hall of Famer, actor, public figure. They had divorced 2 years prior. What many didn't know, at least not in full detail, was the history of domestic violence, the emergency calls, the restraining orders, and Nicole's documented fear that one day her former husband would kill her. But fear isn't evidence. So on June 13th, when officers from LAPD's West Bureau Homicide Unit arrived on site, they began with facts, not headlines. Photographs were taken. Blood patterns were mapped. The first round of preliminary forensics began that morning at 7:15 a.m. Detectives Mark Furman and Tom Lang were among the first to walk the perimeter. Inside the gate, a single black leather glove, soaked in blood, sat beneath a cluster of azalea bushes to the left of the front walkway. To the right, a bloody footprint, partial but distinct. Further along the path, a knit cap, dark wool, possibly navy. All items were collected, bagged, and tagged, but nothing about the scene screamed random. Nicole's keys were still in her purse, her wallet untouched. There was no sign of struggle inside the home. Her dog, an Akita, had blood on its paws, later determined to be from attempting to wake or protect her postmortem. A neighbor walking his own dog around midnight reported the Akita roaming the street, leash still attached. It was whimpering, circling, leading him back to the crime scene. That neighbor flagged down LAPD. Nicole's body had multiple lacerations, but the fatal injury was a deep incised wound to the neck. Autopsy later confirmed the wound measured approximately 5.5 inches and severed both carotid arteries. The injury was consistent with a blade held at a downward angle, applied with force, likely in close proximity. Goldman's injuries were clustered: deep gashes on the left side of his chest, abrasions on the forearms, and a penetrating wound to the abdomen. Investigators concluded he had arrived during or shortly after the attack on Nicole. Inside the residence, nothing was out of place. Upstairs, her two children, Sydney, 8, and Justin, 5, remained asleep throughout the event. Nicole had put them to bed earlier that night after attending their dance recital. Timeline reconstruction began with a fixed point. 9:40 p.m., Nicole and her family dined at Messaluna Trattoria in Brentwood. Ronald Goldman, a waiter there and friend of Nicole, was off shift but returned to the restaurant around 9:50 p.m. to pick up the sunglasses Nicole's mother had left behind. He left again just before 10 p.m. to drop them off at Nicole's. She was likely killed between 10:15 and 10:30 p.m. Goldman was presumed to have arrived during or immediately after the act. No surveillance footage was recovered from nearby homes. No security systems recorded motion. But forensic data began to paint a tight window of opportunity, one short enough to be calculated, but long enough for someone familiar with the neighborhood to approach, attack, and disappear. The investigation would soon widen and scrutiny would intensify. But what set this case apart wasn't just the crime, it was the context, the intersection of fame, violence, and credibility in the American justice system. Detective Lang reportedly told a colleague that morning, "We've got a homicide and a damn circus on the way." He wasn't wrong. When investigators began cross-referencing background materials within hours of identifying Nicole Brown Simpson as the primary victim, one source stood out. Not a criminal record, but a history of documented fear. The kind that rarely makes headlines until it's too late. Nicole had filed for divorce from O.J. Simpson in February 1992, citing irreconcilable differences. On paper, it was procedural. In practice, it followed a series of 911 calls, bruises noticed by friends, and reports of threats made behind closed doors. The separation was legal, but the connection between them never fully dissolved. By June 1994, Nicole had her own life. She lived independently with her two children. She maintained a fitness routine, took classes, and tried to stabilize a post-divorce routine. But in the months leading up to the double homicide, there were signs that whatever boundaries she'd built were being tested or ignored. The LAPD obtained prior call logs tied to her residence. The most critical came from New Year's Day 1989, 5 years before her death, when Nicole called 911 and was audibly panicked. That call was recorded. On it, Nicole could be heard saying, "He's going to kill me. He's O.J. Simpson. You know his record." The responding officer noted visible injuries and extreme emotional distress. A second officer, in later court testimony, stated Nicole had a black eye and bruises on both arms. Nicole eventually dropped formal charges. Like many domestic abuse survivors, she returned to the relationship after promises of change. But by 1993, she had begun keeping notes. Investigators recovered a handwritten letter from a locked cabinet in her home, a kind of personal log of arguments, stalking, and emotional manipulation. Entries included phrases like, "He watches me," and "he lets himself in without knocking." Several friends confirmed that Nicole often expressed discomfort with her ex-husband's presence near the property, particularly when he wasn't supposed to be there. A key piece of forensic development in this phase was the restraining order Nicole filed in 1992, immediately after their divorce. Though later dropped, the court records showed that she cited unpredictable behavior and repeated verbal threats. Detectives cross-referenced this with other known police incidents and found at least 8 calls placed from Nicole's address over the prior 5 years, all flagged under domestic disturbance. At the coroner's office, pathologists continued work on both victims. Nicole's autopsy confirmed what first responders had suspected. A single incised wound to the neck was the fatal injury, delivered with such force that it severed the left and right carotid arteries. The laceration was nearly 6 inches in length, running from left to right at a downward angle. There were also defensive wounds on both hands, indicating she may have tried to shield herself. Analysts noted that while there were no signs of sexual assault, the intensity of the neck wound reflected personal animosity, not opportunistic violence. Forensic psychologists consulted by LAPD confirmed that the wound pattern and scene composition were overkill, consistent with someone emotionally invested in the victim. While this didn't indicate a specific identity, it narrowed the behavioral profile. This was not an impulsive act committed by a stranger. It was controlled, focused, and unhurried. Detectives also turned to Nicole's civil attorney, who provided a copy of a custody dispute Nicole had been preparing to file. Within it were notes indicating she felt watched and believed she was being followed. One quote stood out to investigators. "If anything happens to me, look to him." It was dated April 1994, 8 weeks before the murders. These written statements, now considered indirect declarations, became central to shaping the investigation's direction. Back at the crime lab, attention shifted to 2 other discoveries made in her home that hadn't initially raised red flags. A digital answering machine with several saved voicemails, and a personal organizer containing phone numbers, calendar entries, and receipts from recent appointments. One call, timestamped June 12th at 6:05 p.m., featured a male voice asking to see her one last time. The number came from an unlisted landline, later confirmed to belong to a close contact of Nicole's previous life. That forensic pivot Shifting from crime scene blood patterns to prior behavioral documentation proved essential. In many cases, past threats are seen as context. Here they were predictive. The case file continued to expand. But among all the physical and digital evidence, it was Nicole's words, written, spoken, logged, and ignored, that built a profile stronger than fingerprints. She didn't just live with fear, she archived it. In a private meeting, one investigator asked aloud, "What do you do with a case when the victim predicted her own murder?" And no one listened. The answer would unfold in courtrooms, headlines, in homes across America in the months ahead. At approximately 11:45 p.m. on June 12, 1994, the bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman lay cooling beneath the quiet dark of Brentwood. By 4:01 p.m. the next morning, a third figure had entered the scope of law enforcement concern, not as a confirmed suspect, but as someone who, given proximity, history, and timeline, needed to be accounted for. That person was no longer in Los Angeles. By 5:30 a.m., officers attempting to notify the next of kin and collect a preliminary statement learned that O.J. Simpson had boarded a late-night flight to Chicago the night prior. According to airline records and a ticket timestamp, he left Los Angeles International Airport at 11:45 p.m., just minutes after the window in which the coroner would later estimate the time of death. Investigators secured the address of Simpson's Rockingham estate in Brentwood. A team was dispatched immediately to preserve the residence. The first responder noted that Simpson's white 1993 Ford Bronco was parked outside the gate, slightly askew, not tightly angled like usual. The vehicle was locked. No visible blood from a distance, but reddish-brown smears were later observed on the interior driver's side door panel. The SUV was towed to an LAPD evidence garage and sealed for forensic processing. By noon, detectives Tom Lang and Philip Vanatter reached Simpson by phone at his Chicago hotel. The call was brief. He was informed that his ex-wife had been killed and that detectives would like to speak with him in person. Simpson expressed shock, but agreed to return on the next available flight. When Simpson landed in Los Angeles around midday on June 13, he was met by his attorneys and escorted to police headquarters. He agreed to provide a voluntary statement, not under arrest. The interview lasted about 32 minutes and was recorded. He told investigators he had been home the night of the murders, packing for Chicago, and went to bed early. When pressed on exact times and actions between 9:30 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., he could not provide precise details. The statement was noted for its ambiguity and lack of time-stamped actions. Simpson claimed he had packed, taken a shower, and possibly fallen asleep on the couch. When asked about any cuts or injuries to his hand, officers had observed a fresh wound on the middle finger of his left hand. He said he had cut it on a broken glass in his Chicago hotel room after learning of Nicole's death. That explanation would become a point of contradiction as forensic timelines progressed. LAPD's Scientific Investigation Division processed the Ford Bronco over the next 48 hours. The vehicle yielded several notable findings: bloodstains on the driver's side door, dashboard, and center console, a black wool knit cap matching fibers found at the Bundy crime scene, a second blood-soaked leather glove near the rear cargo area. Preliminary DNA analysis using PCR amplification confirmed that the blood on the console matched Nicole Brown Simpson. Blood found on the glove included a mixture consistent with both victims and a third unidentified contributor, later matched to Simpson. The vehicle also contained trace carpet fibers and foliage debris, plant matter consistent with azalea bushes, like those bordering Nicole's front walkway. One fact complicated the timeline further. A limousine driver, Alan Park, had been dispatched to pick Simpson up for his flight to Chicago. In sworn statements, Park indicated he arrived at Rockingham around 10:25 p.m., but received no response from the call box at the gate. He waited until approximately 10:40 p.m., then made several attempts to call the house. He claimed that no lights were on and that the Bronco was not in the driveway at that time. At 10:55 p.m., Park observed a shadowy figure, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing, moving across the driveway. Moments later, the house lights came on. Simpson exited the home shortly after, bags in hand, stating he had overslept. Park drove him to LAX without further incident. This segment of the timeline placed Simpson unaccounted for between 9:45 p.m. and 10:55 p.m., a critical 1-hour window. No confirmed alibi, no security footage, just overlapping fragments of motion, statements, and forensic evidence, now pointing toward an intentional disappearance from view. During this period, LAPD also analyzed telephone records and movement logs from Simpson's residence. There were no outgoing calls from the landline between 9:15 p.m. and 11:00 p.m. His personal cell phone showed no activity. In addition, police obtained a timeline of vehicle sightings, including 2 civilian tips, placing the white Bronco in the vicinity of South Bundy Drive around 10:15 p.m., though these remained unconfirmed at that stage. Inside the house at Rockingham, officers discovered a trail of blood droplets leading from the front driveway into the foyer and continuing toward the kitchen sink. Small pools were found beneath the bathroom counter. All tested positive for human blood and were consistent with Nicole's profile. The more evidence was gathered, the narrower the window became. But perhaps the most unexpected shift came on June 17th. That morning, Simpson was scheduled to turn himself in after being named a person of interest. Instead, he disappeared. His attorneys announced that he had left home around 10:00 a.m. and was considered missing. LAPD issued an all-points bulletin. At approximately 5:56 p.m., California Highway Patrol received a call reporting a white Ford Bronco traveling on Interstate 5 in Orange County, driven by Al Cowlings, a close friend of Simpson. Simpson was in the back seat, allegedly armed, holding a handgun to his own head. Cowlings spoke to 911 dispatchers. "He's got a gun to his head. He just wants to go see his mother." The pursuit unfolded live on national television. Over 95 million viewers watched as a white SUV moved slowly along the 405 freeway, trailed by dozens of police cruisers. It wasn't a high-speed chase. It was an extraction in real time, soaked in speculation and tension. 2 hours later, the Bronco pulled into Simpson's home driveway. Officers negotiated for another 45 minutes before Simpson exited the vehicle and surrendered without resistance. He carried a bag containing a passport, $9,000 in cash, a disguise, and a loaded .357 Magnum revolver. No one watching that night could say what came next would be simple. The investigation had turned national. But within the files, within the DNA samples, the timestamps and silent gaps, detectives knew they were chasing more than a fugitive. They were chasing a timeline too perfect to be natural. As one officer later wrote in his report, the gaps weren't empty, they were staged. By late June 1994, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office had formally filed charges in the case. The defendant was no longer just a former athlete or celebrity figure. He was now the focus of a double homicide prosecution in one of the most visible criminal cases in American history. The state's position was clear. 2 people had been murdered in cold blood, and the evidence they believed would show intent, proximity, and motive. But what looked straightforward on paper rarely stayed that way in court. Deputy District Attorneys Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden were appointed lead prosecutors. Both had extensive experience in violent crime cases. Clark, known for her work on complex domestic abuse prosecutions, immediately recognized the narrative weight of the evidence. Prior 911 calls, visible injuries from past reports, handwritten notes, and documented restraining orders. For her, the foundation of motive was behavioral, cumulative, and written long before the crime occurred. The prosecution began by establishing a forensic core. At the heart of that was physical trace evidence. 2 black leather gloves, one recovered at the crime scene, one found at Rockingham near the defendant's home. DNA analysis from both gloves revealed a tri-mix of blood traces matching Nicole Brown Simpson, Ronald Goldman, and O.J. Simpson. Fibers from the defendant's vehicle, his Ford Bronco, matched carpet fibers from inside his house, and soil particles consistent with azalea roots from the Bundy property. Shoe prints recovered at the scene were matched to a rare Bruno Magli model, size 12, the same size worn by the defendant. Only a few hundred pairs had been sold nationwide. Photographic evidence surfaced showing Simpson wearing that brand during a prior event. The chain of custody for each piece of physical evidence was logged in full. Each transfer between officers, each lab test, every slide, photograph, and label had to withstand not only scrutiny, but national attention. The prosecution's pretrial brief focused on 4 main pillars: Proximity and opportunity within the crime window, 9:45, 10:50 p.m. Lack of alibi supported by driver testimony and household call records. Physical evidence connecting the defendant to both the scene and aftermath. Behavioral history, including threats, surveillance, and prior acts of intimidation. But from the start, internal notes show the prosecution acknowledged several points of exposure. First, the LAPD's handling of the crime scene came under review. At least 3 officers entered the Bundy property before it was fully secured. The glove at Rockingham was not collected until hours later by Detective Mark Foreman, whose credibility would later become a core issue. The vehicle, though secured, was left unattended at one point during transport, opening the door to chain of custody challenges. Second, the DNA technology used in 1994, while advanced, was still new to many jurors. Polymerase chain reaction, PCR analysis, and restriction fragment length polymorphism, RFLP tests, had to be explained clearly. The prosecution's own forensic experts cautioned that any mishandling in lab processing could open the evidence to attack, not on accuracy, but on interpretation and contamination risk. Third, media coverage had made neutrality nearly impossible. Every potential juror had heard about the case. Most had seen the slow-speed chase. The prosecution requested sequestration early in the pretrial phase, anticipating that press exposure would shape public opinion in ways no courtroom motion could undo. Behind closed doors, Clark's team debated how to prioritize the presentation of evidence. Behavioral testimony, such as Nicole's written notes in 911 tapes, had emotional impact but risked being portrayed as character evidence, not direct proof of murder. The gloves and DNA were stronger scientifically, but would require clear and concise interpretation under pressure. By July, the DA's office began building their witness list. It included LAPD crime scene technicians, coroner's office pathologists, DNA analysts from Cellmark and DOJ labs, the limo driver, Alan Park, friends and family of both victims, police officers who responded to previous domestic incidents. The prosecution also prepared for pretrial motions from the defense that would attempt to suppress the gloves, challenge search warrant validity, and argue that the defendant was being unfairly targeted due to his race and celebrity status. Early strategy memos from Clark's office show a consistent theme: control the courtroom narrative before the defense reframes it. But that would be harder than anyone predicted. Even before opening arguments, defense attorneys had begun laying the foundation for their own story. A story not of blood and timelines, but of institutional bias, faulty forensics, and a police department under pressure to find a culprit fast. And behind the scenes, a storm was building around one specific detective. From the moment the defense team came together, it was clear this wouldn't follow the usual trajectory of a homicide trial. The team called themselves the Dream Team, a term that would become inseparable from the trial's legacy. But behind the polished strategy and courtroom rhetoric, their work began with one goal: undermine the integrity of the state's evidence by undermining the people behind it. At the center of that strategy stood Detective Mark Foreman. Foreman was the LAPD officer who had entered the Rockingham estate the morning after the murders. He was also the one who found the second glove near a walkway behind the main house, an item the prosecution called one of the strongest forensic links between crime scene and suspect. But as the defense reviewed officer reports, chain of custody entries, and interview logs, they saw gaps that could be used as leverage: gaps in time, gaps in documentation, and eventually a gap in public trust. They started by scrutinizing Foreman's prior conduct. His own statements, audio from years past, and his reputation inside the department raised concerns. And then they found it, a series of taped interviews recorded years earlier in which Foreman used racist slurs and made inflammatory remarks about suspect treatment, particularly targeting black men. These tapes had no direct tie to the current case, but in a courtroom where credibility was everything, they were explosive. The defense's theory didn't begin with denying the physical evidence. Instead, it focused on who might have handled that evidence and how much the public could rely on it. They didn't need to argue that the blood on the glove wasn't real. They needed to suggest that someone with a motive, could have planted it. That argument became their framing device: a department under pressure to close a high-profile case, and a detective with a documented history of bias who had both motive and opportunity to manipulate the scene. While the prosecution highlighted DNA matches and timelines, the defense returned again and again to process failure. They noted that Furman entered the Rockingham property without a warrant. They questioned why the glove wasn't found by the first responding officer. And most importantly, they drove doubt by showing that this detective, tasked with securing key evidence, had previously lied under oath. When Furman was called to the stand in March 1995, he was asked a direct question. Had he ever used the N-word in the past 10 years? His answer, no. That was a lie, and the defense had the tapes to prove it. The moment played out live in court, and it marked a turning point in the trial. The glove, once physical proof, was now tainted by its finder. No matter how clean the DNA, the chain of belief had been severed. The prosecution tried to recover. They emphasized that the scientific data remained unchanged. They argued that a detective's personal failure did not erase biological truth. But to a jury exposed to a growing theory of racial profiling and evidence planting, the damage was done. From a forensic standpoint, the evidence remained powerful. Blood drops on the Bronco matched the victims, shoe prints linked to rare Italian footwear, hair and fiber matches, all backed by lab results. But from a strategic standpoint, trust was eroding. Not because of the crime itself, but because of how the investigation unfolded in the hands of flawed human beings. The trial, once about two murders, was morphing into something larger. It had become a public reckoning over race, power, and institutional bias. And every decision, every misstep, every inconsistency by law enforcement gave the defense more ground. This wasn't just a defense, it was a deconstruction. And what the prosecution hadn't anticipated, despite years of courtroom experience, was how quickly a single false statement from a detective could shift the burden of proof back into the shadows. On June 15, 1995, in the middle of a trial already defined by procedural ambushes and media saturation, the prosecution authorized a courtroom demonstration they believed would seal their narrative. The defendant would try on the gloves. These were not just any gloves. They were the black leather Eris lights, size extra large, recovered from two different locations, one at the Bundy crime scene, the other behind the main house at Rockingham. Both contained blood from Nicole Brown Simpson, Ronald Goldman, and O.J. Simpson, as confirmed through DNA analysis. They had become symbolic connectors, tying suspect to scene with minimal interpretation required. The state had been confident. Lab analysis had verified size and origin. The gloves were a rare model, only about 200 pairs sold in that particular design. O.J. Simpson was known to own a pair. There were even photographs placing him in similar gloves during past public appearances. No fingerprints were recoverable from either glove, but that wasn't unexpected. Leather rarely yields viable prints, especially when contaminated with blood. The prosecution believed a simple demonstration, showing the glove's fit, would visually reinforce months of testimony. They instructed criminalist Dennis Fung and LAPD detective Richard Rubin to supervise the courtroom procedure. Simpson would be asked to try on the gloves in front of the jury. The courtroom was silent when it happened. Simpson, standing, pulled on a pair of latex gloves first, for preservation of evidence. Then slowly, he slipped his hands into the leather gloves. He made a visible effort, flexing his fingers, appearing to struggle. His fingers splayed out. His palms turned toward the jury. He shook his head. They looked too tight. The prosecution was caught off guard. It had been their demonstration, their moment to lock in a physical truth. But now the visual, televised, replayed endlessly, had become the defense's strongest moment. That one scene visually contradicted months of forensic data. It didn't matter that dried leather shrinks. It didn't matter that Simpson had worn latex gloves underneath, or that he had discontinued his arthritis medication, which may have swollen his joints. In a court of law, explanation matters. But in a courtroom ruled by perception, optics often win. The phrase came quickly, simple, rhythmic. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Johnny Cochran didn't say it that day, but the line would soon follow. It crystallized a larger strategy, turning the state's best evidence into a spectacle of doubt. Behind the scenes, the prosecution scrambled. They called glove experts to explain shrinkage. They prepared to call orthopedic specialists to testify about joint swelling. They sought to clarify that the gloves had been soaked in blood and refrigerated, then unfrozen and handled during evidence review. But the damage had been done. It wasn't just a failed demonstration. It was a credibility breach. Prosecutors had taken a risk on visual drama. The defense didn't need to disprove the evidence. They only needed the jury to distrust how it had been handled. That courtroom moment became the trial's most repeated image. Television replayed it. Commentary exploded. Outside the courthouse, lines blurred between journalism and entertainment. What happened in that room, during those 60 seconds, became more important than lab reports or scientific testimony. Legal scholars later pointed out that glove size wasn't decisive in terms of evidentiary weight, but in practice, it shifted momentum. Jurors were watching, not calculating. If the physical evidence didn't align in their minds with what they were seeing, no amount of forensic explanation could restore it. In that way, the gloves weren't just evidence anymore. They became a metaphor for the trial itself, a system that should have fit cleanly, but didn't. Back at the DA's office, frustration was mounting. Prosecutors noted that the defense wasn't disproving evidence. They were introducing doubt through theatrical contradiction. And in a case where the burden rested on proof beyond a reasonable doubt, even a single visual contradiction could outweigh layers of technical accuracy. That moment was a turning point, not just because of what the gloves did or didn't prove, but because it showed how the trial was no longer about evidence alone. It was about narrative. The jury wasn't just weighing DNA and shoe prints. They were responding to trust, or the lack of it. And that trust was eroding. By the summer of 1995, the O.J. Simpson trial had already eclipsed its own legal framework. What began as a double homicide investigation was now a national referendum on policing, race, media, and the very definition of justice. Inside Department 103 of the Los Angeles Superior Court, the 12 jurors at the center of that maelstrom carried a responsibility that had grown far beyond evidence. The jury had been seated months earlier after exhaustive vetting. They were selected not only for legal neutrality, but for perceived resistance to media influence. Still, sequestration, intended to shield them, came at a cost. Isolated from family and friends under constant supervision, jurors endured nearly 9 months of confinement in a hotel. The psychological toll was real. Some lost jobs, some lost sleep. One requested to be dismissed due to anxiety. The court denied it. Behind courtroom doors, what they were asked to evaluate remained straightforward in legal theory. Did the prosecution prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that Simpson committed both murders? But in practice, that task became increasingly difficult as the state's case, once considered airtight, began to leak credibility. Testimony fatigue set in. Over 130 witnesses had taken the stand. Forensic analysts described blood drop trajectories, DNA amplification cycles, and allele groupings. Police officers recounted arrival times, search protocols, and scene contamination precautions. It was dense, often repetitive, and increasingly clouded by contradictions introduced during cross-examination. Defense attorneys, particularly Johnny Cochran and Barry Scheck, leaned into that fatigue. They reframed forensic certainty as interpretation. One expert's confidence became another's margin of error. In the hands of the defense, technical ambiguity became strategic advantage. And it worked, especially when tied to the credibility collapse of Detective Mark Furman, whose perjury in Chapter 5 cast a long shadow over every piece of evidence he had touched. Public opinion outside the courtroom was already fractured. Polling data at the time showed a deep racial divide. Many Black Americans viewed the case as a symbol of institutional overreach, while many white Americans interpreted it as a clear-cut criminal prosecution. That perception seeped into media commentary, talk radio, and dinner tables across the country. The courtroom had cameras, but the real theater was nationwide. Inside the jury room, instructions were strict. Focus on the facts, not the coverage. But that line had blurred long before deliberations began. Jurors had watched a glove that didn't fit. They had seen a detective lie. They had heard the phrase, "beyond a reasonable doubt," repeated enough times that it began to lose weight. Reasonable doubt no longer meant possible innocence. It meant anything less than perfect. The trial had lasted over 250 days. Deliberations lasted less than 4 hours. The verdict was reached swiftly. Too swiftly, some would later argue. The prosecution was notified. Defense counsel prepared statements. The city braced. What came next would not satisfy everyone. On October 3, 1995, after 9 months of proceedings, 133 days of televised courtroom arguments, and nearly 45 million Americans tuned in live, the jury returned with their decision. It took less than 4 hours of deliberation. At 10:07 a.m. Pacific Time, in Department 103 of the Los Angeles County Superior Court, the foreperson read the verdict, not guilty of the crime of murder. O.J. Simpson sat stone-faced. Nicole Brown Simpson's mother audibly gasped. Fred Goldman clutched a photo of his son Ron, his expression taut with disbelief. Across the country, reactions fractured along racial, social, and political lines. In predominantly black neighborhoods, celebrations erupted. Many saw the verdict as a rare victory against a system they believed had long brutalized their communities. In many white communities, the ruling was met with outrage, disbelief, and grief for the victims. Polls taken in the days following the verdict captured a chasm. Over 70% of white Americans believed O.J. Simpson was guilty. Nearly the same percentage of black Americans believed he was not. For the prosecution, the outcome was a bitter defeat. Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden faced a wave of public scrutiny. Their decision to focus heavily on the DNA evidence, rather than foreground the domestic violence history, was debated by legal analysts for years to come. But it was the handling of Detective Mark Furman, the exposure of his racist statements and perjury, that irreparably weakened their case. To jurors, this wasn't simply about murder. It had become a referendum on the LAPD itself. While the criminal court system had rendered its decision, the families of the victims did not stop seeking accountability. In 1996, the Goldman and Brown families filed a civil lawsuit against Simpson, alleging wrongful death. Unlike in criminal court, the burden of proof in civil court was lower, preponderance of evidence rather than beyond a reasonable doubt. And unlike the criminal trial, cameras were banned. The drama played out quietly but intensely over the course of several months. In February 1997, a Santa Monica jury unanimously found O.J. Simpson liable for the wrongful deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. He was ordered to pay $33.5 million in damages, $8.5 million in compensatory damages to the Goldman family, and $25 million in punitive damages to both families. Though the judgment marked a form of legal vindication, it was largely symbolic. Simpson's assets had been depleted by legal costs. The Goldman family fought for years to collect on the judgment, eventually securing the rights to Simpson's book manuscript, which they controversially released in 2007 under the title If I Did It. The financial consequences of the civil verdict further isolated Simpson. Endorsement deals were long gone. Public appearances were met with protests. He moved to Florida, a state with strong protections against seizure of assets like pensions and homes. While he lived in relative comfort, the shadow of the case never left him. But the true legacy of the Simpson case stretched far beyond the courtroom. It redefined media coverage of criminal trials. It changed how jurors were selected and how domestic violence cases were handled in the public eye. It prompted police departments to reevaluate racial bias within their ranks. And it reshaped public discourse on race, justice, celebrity, and gender-based violence, issues that still reverberate today. For years, legal scholars, journalists, and ordinary citizens debated the meaning of the verdict. Was it a failure of justice or a reflection of it? Had the defense merely done its job, or had it manipulated the truth? These are not easy questions. What is clear is that the trial was not just about O.J. Simpson. It was about the society that created the conditions for the trial to unfold as it did. Decades of mistrust between black communities and law enforcement, the tabloid hunger for celebrity scandal, and a legal system under the weight of both. It is perhaps fitting that there has never been closure. Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman's deaths remain unsolved in the legal sense. No one else was ever charged. The LAPD quietly marked the case as cleared by arrest. No new leads emerged. No evidence shifted the narrative in a new direction. The case, frozen in its cultural moment, continues to live on as a symbol, of what justice can and cannot provide. As of July 9, 2025, 30 years after the murders, public opinion remains divided. Documentaries, dramatizations, and think pieces continue to revisit the events, often asking more questions than providing answers. O.J. Simpson, now 77, was released from parole in 2021 after serving time in a separate armed robbery case in Nevada. He has largely withdrawn from public life, though occasional social media posts still spark controversy. For the families of the victims, life moved forward, but never beyond. Fred Goldman has continued to advocate for victims' rights, turning grief into quiet resolve. Tanya Brown, Nicole's sister, has become a speaker on domestic violence and mental health, sharing the message that signs of abuse should never be dismissed or minimized. There are no perfect endings in real life, no neat resolutions or cinematic justice, but perhaps the lesson from this case is this: the pursuit of truth is not the same as the pursuit of a verdict. And while courts may render decisions, society must decide what it chooses to remember and why. What this case leaves behind isn't just a verdict, it's a mirror, a reflection of how justice is pursued, distorted, and debated in America. If there's one thing I've learned from telling this story, it's that silence, whether from fear, fame, or failure, can cost lives. And truth, no matter how delayed or divided, still demands to be faced. How do you interpret the legacy of this case? Do you believe justice was ever served? I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what you think. Drop a comment and let's talk. If this video resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel for more real stories that uncover hard truths and spark meaningful conversation.